Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar. We're just waiting for everyone to join before we get started. Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Nellie Sabor, and I'd like to welcome you to the Autism Intervention Research Network on Physical Health, the AARP May 2023 webinar, Sound Sensitivity in Autistic Adults, Clinical Manifestations and Correlates. So thank you all for joining us today. Because of the number of participants, your audio will be muted throughout the call. However, you can submit questions at any point during the presentation via the Q&A feature or in the chat box on your webinar console. Just a friendly reminder to please be respectful when communicating in the chat and asking questions, and note that only questions or comments pertaining to the presentation will be addressed. So this entire webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the AARP website, which I will put in the chat right here. And you may also view the presentation slides here. There will be a short evaluation survey at the close of the webinar. We invite you to provide feedback on this webinar and also provide suggestions for future webinars. So in the interest of time, let's get started. Next slide, please. We first want to acknowledge the Health Resources and Services Administration as the funding source of the AARP. So here's the information on the slide. Next slide, please, Zack. Now it is my honor to introduce our presenter for today, Zack Williams. Zack Williams is an autistic MD PhD candidate in the neuroscience graduate program and Department of Hearing and Speech Sciences at Vanderbilt University. He's also an affiliate of the Vanderbilt University's first Center for Autism Innovation, vice chair of the Autism Intervention Research Network on Physical Health Answer Committee, and co-chair of the INSTAR Autistic Researchers Committee. Zack's research focuses on sensory manifestations of autism in adulthood, the assessment and treatment of co-occurring physical and mental health problems in autistic adults, and the development of novel questionnaires and clinical measures to assess core and associated features of autism across the lifespan. You can follow him on Twitter at Quant Psychiatry. Zack, I'll leave it to you.
Sorry, I was muted, but thank you, Nellie, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming to listen to me talk about sound sensitivity. I am very excited to be here and to give the AARP webinar this month. This is a very exciting topic for me, as it is the thing that I have done my entire dissertation work on and have worked tirelessly to try and bring more work to the autism field. And so with that, I will just get started. And so just a quick outline about the talk today. So first I'm going to give a little bit of an overview about, what is sound sensitivity, what are the different types of sound sensitivity, and how does it apply to autism. And then I'm going to talk mostly about two different studies that I and my group have done. One is looking just at the prevalence and characteristics of different sound sensitivity conditions in the autistic adult population specifically. And the second study is validating a new measure of sound sensitivity that I created specifically in autistic and non-autistic adults. And then I talk a little bit about future directions for this area of work. What can we do next to better understand these conditions in the autistic population? So first, just to talk a little bit about this area of work, let's give a little bit of background. So autism, as I assume many of the viewers know, is a lifelong neurodevelopmental disability that affects now an estimated 1 in 36 individuals in the United States, based on the most recent numbers from the CDC. And since 2013, and that is the publication of the DSM-5, we have now considered altered reactivity to sensory aspects of the environment as a core diagnostic feature of the condition. So within autism, there are two sort of core domains of autistic traits. There are the social communication difficulties, and then these non-social features, which are often called restricted and repetitive behaviors. And so within that, we also have sensory reactivity differences. And in here, there are hyperreactivity, sensory hyperreactivity, so reactivity to things like sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell, all of the different senses, but this is being excessively overreactive to those. And so what I'm going to talk today about really is sound sensitivity, being overly reactive to sound. And so that falls within this hyper category. There's also hyporeactivity, being underreactive to those same types of senses, and then seeking out different sensations. Those also fall within sensory reactivity differences, though they aren't necessarily within the purview of today's talks, though they're definitely very applicable to autism diagnosis and other areas of the autistic experience. Not to downplay them at all, just don't necessarily have time to talk about them today. But specifically thinking about the types of sound sensitivity we have in autism, let's look at that. So sound sensitivity, though, is more of a layperson word. And in clinical parlance, we actually talk about this term called decreased sound tolerance. So what does that mean? So it really is defined as decreased sound tolerance being difficulty tolerating everyday sounds in one's environment. And this can be for any reason. It can be because the sounds are too loud, because the sounds cause anxiety, because the sounds make you angry, because the sounds make you disgusted, really anything. Just you see a person, they have a hard time with sounds around them, and because of that, they are having difficulty tolerating the sounds. And again, like I mentioned earlier, this is a core feature of autism in that hyper domain. And so based on a meta-analysis that my team and I did, about 35 to 45% of autistic people at any given time, and about 50 to 70% of autistic people over their entire lifetime have this particular feature at a clinically significant level. And on top of that, the prevalence seems to increase with age. So not all autistic people necessarily display this feature at birth or in early childhood, but over time, if the samples get older, by about middle childhood or adolescence, you seem to have even higher features, higher prevalence of this feature, such that about 60 or 70% by about age 10 or 11 seem to be showing this. We don't actually have great data on this in later adolescence or adulthood. Most of the autism research that has been done so far has been done in younger children. But nevertheless, there is plenty of data or plenty of like smaller scale studies to show that there are indeed autistic adults who do report sound sensitivity, just not good prevalence data to show how many autistic adults are actually showing this feature. So what is the impact of decreased sound tolerance? Well, for one, it can be quite disabling. And it's really, one of the main things that a lot of autistic people say is that it worsens their anxiety, it causes a lot of stress and emotion dysregulation, and it's very interfering. Sounds are everywhere, right? And so, by definition, these are everyday sounds. And so this is going to cause interference at school, at home, and in the workplace. And it's going to make places less accessible. So anywhere there are sounds, there are going to be sounds that are bothersome. And so this stops people from accessing those places. Public places become less accessible. People can't go to the grocery store. People can't go to their workplace. People can't go to concerts. People can't go to sporting events. People can't go to just cafes, restaurants, things like that. And it's a problem. People can't participate in activities they would otherwise like to because there are too many sounds. For folks who really can't communicate their distress, sometimes this results in dangerous behaviors, especially in children who have limited language or intellectual ability. When they have an episode of something like elopement or aggression, self-injury, this could be triggered by their decreased sound tolerance. And on top of that, there is a lot of wearing of ear protection. Oftentimes you see autistic people who are wearing big old headphones like this. And obviously that's not necessarily a problem by itself, but of course, when you wear big old headphones like this, it will necessarily stop you from being able to hear a lot of things around you. And so you must take the headphones off in order to communicate necessarily. So if you aren't necessarily able to hear the people talking to you, or able to hear a car coming towards you, able to hear people around you trying to get your attention, I mean, that can stop you from necessarily being a part of social interactions about you. It can help you be aware of safety signals, things like that. And so, with this, there are a whole lot of ways that sound tolerance can be disabling. And in some ways, the accommodations for sound tolerance can also be disabling. And then additionally, like I mentioned earlier, the decreased sound tolerance symptoms are also reported by many autistic adults. We don't have a lot of research on the prevalence or the clinical features or the correlates in this age group, which represents a gap in literature. But nevertheless, autistic adults do seem to, in several qualitative studies, say that this continues to be an area which affects their lives quite greatly, and is an area where quality of life could be improved if there were better services and supports for this. So one thing to note is that decreased sound tolerance, as I mentioned, is sort of an umbrella term. Now, there are multiple distinct and overlapping conditions that actually make up decreased sound tolerance. It's not one thing. And so subtypes of decreased sound tolerance can be quite useful because there are probably underlying conditions that could be more homogeneous than just saying, oh, well, this person doesn't like sound. What does that actually mean? Well, one way to subtype the different types of sound tolerance is to think about what is the underlying cause of the sound tolerance issue. What is the reason that the sound is bothersome? And that could be perhaps more related to the underlying issue at a neurobiological or psychological level. And so in this way, I and several others have come up with a framework that separates this into 3 different main conditions that make up the majority of different sound tolerance complaints in the autistic population, as well as the general population. The first of these, and the most well-studied, is hyperacusis. And so this is a condition in which everyday sounds of soft or moderate intensity are perceived as excessively loud or sometimes even physically painful. In the general population, this is often associated with tinnitus and hearing loss. And the way to think about this is that oftentimes this is how some sounds tend to sound louder when you have a hangover headache, right? Well, this is like a hangover headache that never goes away. It's just some things are just louder or amplified all the time for people with hyperacusis. It's truly an awful condition and it's no fun. And so it can be very disabling. Sometimes people with hyperacusis have flare-ups of their symptoms. So the loudness disturbance can be further amplified. This can be triggered by other loud sounds. So the symptoms don't have to be static. They can also be associated with other symptoms. So they can have other auditory symptoms. The loudness and pain can go together, things like that. But overall, this is primarily a disturbance of loudness, and it's, we think, a lower level sensory condition that's maybe more in the auditory system than other conditions like misophonia or phonophobia. So the second one of these is misophonia. And so this is what we think to be a more cognitively driven condition where specific trigger sounds, which could be things like chewing, tapping, sniffing, or pen clicking, but really can be any specific sound that matters to the person, elicit very strong negative emotional reactions. And those emotional reactions are characterized by either extreme irritation, anger, or disgust. And so these reactions are things that are just extreme. They're way out of proportion to how much these noises would normally bother people. And I think a lot of people in the audience might think, oh, well, I'm bothered by chewing. I'm bothered by people clicking their pens. I mean, and these are, fairly common reactions, actually. Like a lot of people in the general population may have misophonia to some degree. And this is the difference between having misophonia traits and misophonia, the disorder. It really depends actually how much these traits will cause interference in your life. You don't necessarily just have to be triggered by these reactions, but also to the extent that it is so bothersome, it's causing an actual disability. Again, kind of like the difference between being anxious and having an anxiety disorder, because this again is on a spectrum with normal annoyance with sound. But nevertheless, some people are so bothered by these being triggered by noises that it does become very, very severely disabling and can be a significant problem for people. And then the last one is, in fact, an anxiety disorder, is phonophobia, which is a specific phobia of sounds or certain sound-related situations. And this is actually often secondary to other forms of decreased sound tolerance. A common thing is actually for people with hyperacusis to develop phonophobia. So they will have, for instance, already a loudness tolerance problem, meaning that they find certain situations, let's say, loud noises, to be very difficult to tolerate. But then they also develop a phobia of situations that they think might become loud. Let's say a child finds fire drills to be extremely loud, very hard to tolerate, they cause pain. Well, then if they let's say see a fire alarm, even if the fire alarm is not going off, that's really scary to them because the fire alarm might go off. And so then they develop a fear of fire alarms, not even fire alarms that are going off, just fire alarms in general. And that, of course, because the sound is the thing that they're scared of, is a phonophobia. So you can think of it like that. There are also phonophobias associated with misophonia. People will be worried that they are going to get so angry and lash out at people because they're chewing. They may have never done that before, but they're just scared that they might do that. And this fear can be so excessive and so disabling that the fear becomes the actual thing that is the problem rather than the other kind of decreased sound tolerance. So again, this itself is the problem rather than the other original decreased sound tolerance, and that becomes the thing to treat rather than the underlying condition. So all of these things together make up the underlying umbrella category of decreased sound tolerance. And again, I think this represents a major step forward in autism research in just conceptualizing this, because for the longest time, we generally had just thought of autistic people are sensitive to sound, autistic people have this auditory overreactivity, but we hadn't characterized it more than that. We had just seen, okay, there was some prevalence of auditory sensitivities in the autistic population, and for the most part, it was just left at that. And I think really this was done because we mostly asked parents to characterize their children's auditory reactivity. And this was done by asking them to say, is your child sensitive to sound, yes or no? And do they do things like put their hands over their ears, which is very non-specific because the child is just showing a general distress behavior, not, what sounds are they distressed by? What are the situations that are distressing them, and so on. So then I think the way to move forward in this is to really subtype the types of distress, the situations that distress the person, and how we can move forward here is by really figuring out how these different conditions actually associate with other things and whether there are differential associations with other categories. So without any further ado, I'll get into the first study, which is looking at a population of autistic adults to try and figure some of these things out. So this was a survey study, and then I used Spark. So for those who don't know, Spark is a very large online cohort put together by the Simons Foundation. And from this, we recruited 936 independent autistic adults, meaning they're their own legal guardians, ages 18 to 80. And they were 63% female, 80% non-Hispanic whites, and they were able to self-report on their own decreased sound tolerance experiences, meaning we assumed they were, cognitively able, though obviously we didn't have IQ testing because this was an online survey study. But for the most part, these folks were able to do self-report questionnaires, so they would likely be, for the most part, intellectually able. So these participants did fill out a self-report questionnaire on demographics, medical and psychiatric history, a whole bunch of decreased sound tolerance questionnaires, and various other correlates, which means they were able to fill out a bunch of standardized measures, things like the inventory of hyperacusis symptoms, which is a thing from audiology that was a kind of a standardized measure on hyperacusis that's actually never been used in autism before, as well as some novel questions on hyperacusis that I wrote. They also were able to fill out some misophonia questionnaires, like the Duke misophonia questionnaire, as well as a novel misophonia screening questionnaire that I wrote called the Duke Vanderbilt misophonia screening questionnaire. And then a phonophobia questionnaire that was adapted from the DSM-5 specific phobia severity measure, because there really aren't any phonophobia questionnaires out there. So all of this allowed us to then really get a very deep dive into people's specific profile of decreased sound tolerance, much more than we have ever before in terms of people's phenotypic profile, along with their demographics and their medical history. So what did we find in terms of people's specific symptoms, and what was the prevalence of these conditions? Well, first, I want to just stop a second and ask, or tell you how we defined hyperacusis, misophonia, et cetera. So we didn't just ask, do you have hyperacusis or do you have misophonia? I mean, we could do that, but it's not necessarily a very useful thing. People aren't going around diagnosing these in the community. And so if we just say, did a doctor give you this diagnosis, we'd have very low rates. So what we did instead was we used some of those standardized questionnaires, and then we combined them with questions about, do you have these symptoms? And then do you also have like a substantial amount of clinically significant impairment from these symptoms? So the combination of both symptoms and impairment was what we used to get a person to meeting the case criteria. This is not perfect, obviously, because it would be best if we had a clinical interview to get us those same answers. But the best we could do with a self-report questionnaire is probably about that. And at a large scale, that was sufficient. So with those numbers, we found that about 40% of our total sample, which actually was about what we found in our meta-analysis, met the criteria for hyperacusis. 35% met the criteria for misophonia. And in addition to those, about 27% had about both hyperacusis and misophonia, which was actually very surprising. I was not expecting this whatsoever, that we would have nearly this much overlap between the two conditions. I was very convinced that these were very separate things and they would not have much overlap at all. But nonetheless, there was actually more combined hyperacusis and misophonia than people who had just one or just the other. And though it wasn't really the focus of the study, we also looked at kind of dimensionally the phonophobia questionnaire, and in the people who scored in like the moderate or severe range, about a quarter of the sample also reported that. About a quarter of the people had moderate or severe phonophobia symptoms, though it wasn't necessarily in the same way that we had like both symptoms and impairment. So again, as I mentioned slightly earlier, we had this, overlap of hyperacusis and misophonia that was very surprising. So 253 people. So the majority of people with either hyperacusis or misophonia did actually have both of the conditions, versus a slightly more of the people having just hyperacusis hyperacusis than just misophonia. But again, more of them just having a combined presentation than either alone. Then looking at impairments, we tried to separate them out into different things. We didn't have parallel questions for hyperacusis impairment and misophonia impairment, unfortunately. So it's hard to tell, which was more impairing. But nevertheless, looking at the hyperacusis group, it seems like most of the people did have a moderate problem versus a big or very big problem, but it was fairly split across all of the different groups. So I mean, we had some in the moderate group, some in the big or severe group, and some in the very severe group. And then looking at the misophonia group, this is the based on the Duke misophonia questionnaire. There was a slight different spread, but most of the people in the moderate group, a slightly smaller number of them in the minimal or mild impairment, and then a smaller group who had severe impairment from their misophonia. And because this was based on a different questionnaire than was used for classifying them as having misophonia, actually about 3% of them didn't score on this questionnaire at all because they screened negative on it. So there were some people actually who had misophonia by our other standards who didn't actually have any impairment based on this, who may not even have had misophonia based on this questionnaire. So just to note that. Looking more at the clinical features, we then got into the weeds and tried to figure out, okay, so do these people have, again, this is the first study to really look at these conditions in autism in any great depth. So we have more studies of hyperacusis and misophonia in adults who are not autistic. So let's look more now to see whether or not autistic adults who show hyperacusis and misophonia have similar features. So one thing that non-autistic adults with hyperacusis have been saying for a while is that they actually often show a bit of sound-induced ear pain. So pain hyperacusis is something that it's a phenotype that has been noted in patient communities for a while, but autistic adults have not really been asked about this. And so this is something I wanted to figure out. Is this something that is common in autistic adults? Is this something that's not? And so I asked, and interestingly enough, it does seem like a lot of autistic adults are also reporting sound-induced ear pain, even if this is not something we really have talked about in the autism literature yet. So in the past year, almost 80% of autistic adults in the hyperacusis group said they have experienced pain from sound, and about 65% of them have that at least monthly. Though as far as like having really frequent pain from sound, so more days than not, only about a quarter of the hyperacusis group, so 10% of all of the autistic adults have that much pain. And it's about a 6 to 10 in severity, so moderate pain, which is still pretty significant. Additionally, there are a whole lot of non-loudness or pain related hyperacusis symptoms. So this is just related to the hyperacusis group. But looking at this, sound evoked tinnitus is present in about half of the sample, as are palpitations, ear fullness and pressure in about 40%, headache in about 35%, non-painful discomfort in about 28%, face, neck, or jaw pain 26%, and a whole lot of other things like dyspnea, fluttering, nausea, loss of balance, and other physical symptoms in all about 20%. And only about 7% of people said they have like no other physical sensations from sound. So this means over 90% of people are getting at least some sound evoked physical sensations when they have hyperacusis. That's notable because people are thinking, okay, hyperacusis, it's a loudness condition, it's a pain condition, maybe. But really, I mean, this means there are other things involved, and we should be asking about them. Then the other things to note is that, unlike in the general population, hyperacusis seem to, in autistic people, be an early childhood onset. And this is perhaps not surprising to the autism researchers or the people in the autism community. Everyone who knows an autistic person with sound sensitivity pretty much thinks that that person's sound sensitivity came on very early. It came on with the autism symptoms, etc. But this is still, to audiologists, actually very surprising. It's like, oh, they think of hyperacusis as something that was in middle age onset, perhaps came on with hearing loss, came on with tinnitus. But really, I mean, this is a neurodevelopmental condition. If it is part of the autism, then it would expect to have a time course that is commensurate with the autism. And so this was just confirming that it did indeed have sort of a neurodevelopmental time course. It wasn't acquired later, or if it was, really that was a very small minority of cases, less than 20%. And additionally, the symptoms were typically bilateral, so meaning that people were sensitive to sound in both of their ears rather than just one. And sub 5% of people said that they only were sensitive to sound in one ear, which again means that this is something coming from the brain rather than just one of their ears, which is saying that it's not an ear problem, but a brain problem. Again, good to think about. Not that we were really thinking that this was an ear problem, but a good thing to further confirm. Now, thinking about the clinical features of misophonia, the triggers and reactions were generally very similar to the general population here. We had things like eating noises, mouth and nose noises, repetitive noises like clicking of pens and ticking clocks, but also things like people talking over each other and talking in the background were also very common. The reactions like irritation and annoyance, anger and rage and disgust were very common, with fear and panic being the least common reaction. And then there were also physical symptoms like heart pounding, muscle tension, and sympathetic activation. And these were all very similar to what you would see in the general population. So all of that was very similar to a presentation of misophonia in the general population. And so then we moved on to the correlates of hyperacusis and misophonia. So in this case, both conditions were associated with sex, with females presenting with more or a higher prevalence of both conditions with about odds ratios of about 3. And additionally, gender minorities presented with higher odds ratios as well for both hyperacusis and misophonia. They were both associated with tinnitus. I was expecting this for hyperacusis, but not for misophonia. So that was interesting. Though, to be fair, these are both highly associated. So these are not controlling for the other condition. It would be interesting to see if that holds up with control for the other condition. And interestingly also was that neither was associated with hearing loss. Though, to be fair, these are only diagnosed hearing losses, and we didn't objectively associate with hearing thresholds because we did not have hearing thresholds. And neither was associated with age either. Last thing was, in this study, we were looking at how well above age, sex, gender minority status, and the other condition, anxiety and depression, these conditions would do at predicting a bunch of other clinical outcomes, things like autistic traits, ADHD symptoms, physical symptoms, anger, and quality of life. And crazily enough, even after putting all of those things into the regression, misophonia and hyperacusis both had independent effects on pretty much all of the clinical variables. Hyperacusis did not independently predict anger or quality of life over and above misophonia and the rest of the things, but misophonia did predict all variables, and hyperacusis did predict autistic traits, ADHD symptoms, and somatic symptoms, which was quite impressive, especially given that something like quality of life is almost all entirely predicted by depression, and having additional variants explained by misophonia is good to know. I mean, basically what this says is that these are things that we should care about in our clinical practice because they are going to give us extra information above the general things that we already are measuring. And so that's very useful. So, I mean, the interim conclusion here is that these are both highly prevalent conditions, and they're really associated with a lot of impairments. They're both in like 40 or 35% hyperacusis and misophonia respectively, and with phonophobia also being nearly a quarter of people. Hyperacusis and misophonia phenotypes don't really differ that much from the general population, though one key difference is that hyperacusis is not necessarily acquired at a later age, but is neurodevelopmental. And both conditions are associated with sex, gender, and tinnitus, but not age and hearing loss. And then one last thing is that when you're predicting clinical outcomes, things like autistic trait levels, ADHD, et cetera, both conditions are providing added value above and beyond demographics, anxiety, depression, and each other. So moving on to the next study, we have now a very large body of descriptive evidence to say that these are important conditions, but still not a lot to measure them, right? Those were all done with ad hoc measures, some of the general population measures, but really, not a ton to say, okay, we don't have great measures for these things, especially in autistic adults. So the one thing that I really wanted to do as part of my work was come up with a good, solid way to measure these symptoms in autistic people. So what I did was pooled a whole bunch of secondary data from 3 different data sets. One was a general population sample that I recruited from Prolific. One was a clinical sample that I recruited off of a whole bunch of different social media platforms. It was off of different subreddits for autism, for tinnitus, for hyperacusis and misophonia, tinnitus talk, hyperacusis research. So Quiet was a misophonia support group, and another one was a study done by my colleague Patrick Dwyer, which was partially recruited via Spark, partially recruited via Prolific as well. And it was in autistic adults, ADHD adults, and also the general population, looking at attention, hyperfocus, and other aspects of sound tolerance. And so all of those 3 studies had this questionnaire in it called the Multidimensional Inventory of Sound Tolerance in Adults, or the MIST-A, which is a novel self-report decreased sound tolerance measure that I created. And so the goal of this measure was to figure out whether we could measure these different conditions, hyperacusis, misophonia, and phonophobia, separately from one another at the same time. And the psychometric analyses that we conducted were to validate this measure. So we did an exploratory graph analysis in order to figure out the latent structure of the measure. We conducted either response theory modeling of each dimension separately, and we also did comparisons between autistic and non-autistic adults to better understand whether all of the different subdimensions were different between the groups, and tried to better understand these specific phenotypes. Without any further ado, getting into it. So first, going to break this down a little bit. So we first conducted an exploratory graph analysis, and this is a psychometric technique that uses psychometric network techniques to better understand the measure. I don't need to get too much into the weeds about how this works, but the basic takeaway here is that there were 4 different subdimensions of the questionnaire. So there were 27 items total on the MIST-A, and they broke down into 4 subscales. The first one was a subscale that essentially measured misophonia, and those are these red items over here. They clustered over here, and so those are things like this one, Q4, everyday sounds cause anger or rage. Q5, everyday sounds cause disgust. Q11, sounds bothered me so much that I felt like exploding. Q17, sounds made you want to throw or break things. Q24, I had thoughts of hitting or hurting others to stop the sound. So it's all things that were like, I got angry when the sounds happened, or I felt aggressive, things like that. Then over here are hyperacusis items. So these are items related to either being overwhelmed by the loudness or finding the sounds painful. So these are, I found the everyday sounds to be uncomfortably loud. Everyday sounds causing me physical pain. Specific frequencies were perceived as painful. I had a hard time putting up with loud sounds for more than a few seconds. I had pain from sounds that weren't loud, things like that. And we actually ended up cutting a couple of the items on this scale, 9 and 20. So you were left with 5 items here. Then there was this scale here. This was a fear and overwhelm scale. And so this actually kept a few items that were more autistic in quality, that were originally supposed to capture the phenomenon of like sensory overload, as well as some items that were put in to capture the more of like acute experiences of fear from sound, part of the phonophobia construct. So this is like everyday sounds make me feel afraid or anxious. I felt flooded or overwhelmed by sounds. I was shut down because there was too much noise around me, or I was so overwhelmed by noise that I couldn't focus, things like that. And then the last one is anxiety and avoidance, these purple items right here. And so this is that I avoided places or activities because of how loud they were. I left public places because of the loudness. I ran away from loud noises. I was anxious or worried, anticipating noisy situations, or I spent time preparing for putting off noise-related activities. And so all of these dimensions showed really high average item stability, which was great. So all of these items were very much able to stay in their dimensions, and they were clearly they were clearly able to separate from each other. So this multidimensionality was like robust to the resampling techniques that we used, which was very good. And so I mean, this was very well put together as a scale, which was great, because this is was a sample of about 2,400 people and several clinical groups, which was surprising actually, that we this turned out so well. We only had to cut 3 of these items, 9, 20, and 15 actually. And so what we then did to further refine the scale was using item response theory to check the item quality and generate normed MIST-A subscales. So to do this, we first fit graded response model scores to, or we fit graded response models to each of the MIST-A subscales. So 1 to the misophonia scale, 1 to the hyperacusis scale, 1 to the fear overwhelm scale, 1 to the anxiety avoidance scale. And so these were actually 5-factor graded response models, and we used the general factor as our measure of each of those. We also tested them for differential item functioning, meaning whether the items worked the same way between autistic and non-autistic people, and between people in the clinical group and the general population. The clinical group being autistic, ADHD, and people with like the sound tolerance conditions, versus the people recruited just from the general population sample in Prolific. And so it turned out that all of the items were free of differential item functioning by autism status, which was great, but a few of them did have differential functioning by clinical group status and were removed. And so we cut those 3 items based on that. But the remaining ones were retained, and we had fairly good scores based on that were actually all quite reliable, which is great. We had high reliabilities on all of the items. And then we did actually have fairly high correlations between the scales. And so these correlations are actually just in the clinical group here. They're between 0.44 and 0.77. And these are correlations just within the clinical group, actually. The correlations in the whole sample are even a little bit higher. Somewhere between, I think, 0.6 and 0.8, I think. But which is notable, actually, because these are, as I said, separate constructs. But that might at least be because we have fairly high peaks at 0 here, meaning that some people are not having any sound tolerance whatsoever. And so that means that when you include the whole sample, all of the people who have 0 scores on everything, that is going to inflate the correlations. And so if you cut those people out, that goes down at least somewhat. But nevertheless, I mean, these are still fairly high, you know, especially the fear and avoidance. These 2 scales right here are, you know, still correlating at 0.77, meaning that those are fairly similar constructs, as well as the hyperacusis scale correlating with those 2 scales at, you know, upwards of 0.7, meaning that, you know, all 3 of those scales are right here are all measuring to some extent some, you know, combined hyperacusis phonophobia construct likely. Anyway, moving forward, though, I wanted to then compare scores between the groups, meaning comparing them between autistic adults and non-autistic adults, first between autistic adults and the general population, and then between autistic adults and the clinical group who is non-autistic. So first, looking at the autistic group compared to the general population, the autistic adults had much higher scores than general population adults on all of the MIST-A subscales, although the sizes of these differences were actually fairly varied. So meaning the misophonia scores had an effect size, this is Cohen's D, of about 1, which is still a very large effect size, but comparing that to the anxiety avoidance scale, which had an effect size of 1.5. And the hyperacusis scale of 1.4. However, when we looked at just the clinical group, comparing that to the autism group, none of these remain significant. So while there are big differences between the autistic and general population groups, there are no significant differences between the autism group and the non-autistic clinical group. So this is the ADHD adults, the adults with other decreased sound tolerance conditions, and the autistic adults who may or may not have had decreased sound tolerance conditions. Now, one thing to note is that at least some of the people in the clinical group who were not autistic did self-identify as autistic. We didn't count them as autistic because they didn't have formal diagnoses, but it was possible that at least some of those people did in fact have autism. And so we then decided to exclude the people who self-identified as autistic to see whether or not that might have been muddying the water of this comparison. So in our sensitivity analysis, then we did actually find some significant differences there. There were still no differences in misophonia when we excluded the self-identified autistic people from the clinical group. But then all of the hyperacusis and phonophobia related scales were in fact different in favoring the autistic group, actually. So autistic people had, you know, slightly higher hyperacusis scores, fear overwhelm scores, and anxiety avoidance scores compared to the clinical group, with once the self-identified autistic people were removed from the clinical group, meaning that at least in this case there might be a slightly higher rates of hyperacusis in the autistic population compared to non-autistic clinical people, though this again could be a sampling thing rather than anything else. And so, you know, again, the interim conclusions here, this was a study to validate the first multidimensional self-report measure of DST, the MIST-A, for use in general population and autistic adults with well-tested items that we covered many content domains. Initial psychometric data, I think, are very promising. I'm a little biased, I made the scale, but theoretically distinct scales were more highly correlated than I expected. I mean, we have a separation of hyperacusis and misophonia at least, but the things that seem to measure phonophobia like constructs did correlate pretty highly with things measuring hyperacusis, which again was more than I expected. And lastly, the autistic participants reported greatly elevated symptoms in all the domains of sound sensitivity. So, you know, higher phonophobia, higher hyperacusis, higher misophonia, though the misophonia scale was seemingly less differentiable between the two groups than were the other ones. And that was especially the case when comparing the autistic group versus the non-autistic clinical group, as that did not have any significant differences even when we did our sensitivity analysis. And so let's look at the last little bit, which is our future directions. And this is to try and figure out, what the heck is going on at a more, subjective level. So we have an ongoing laboratory study right now that's actually looking at these decreased sound tolerance conditions, separately, hyperacusis, misophonia, phonophobia, at the level of the brain, at the level of perception. We want to figure out what are the correlates of these conditions, both psychophysically and neurally. So we're recruiting a sample of autistic and non-autistic adults with varying levels of decreased sound tolerance. This could be all the way from no sound tolerance conditions at all to very severe and disabling sound tolerance conditions. And we're administering the MIST-A alongside actually a structured clinical interview for decreased sound tolerance called the DIS that I also created, and laboratory measures of auditory perception and physiology, things like a visual analog scale for rating a bunch of real world sounds and how bothersome they are. We're doing categorical loudness scaling to figure out how people's loudness grows with intensity. We're understanding people's peripheral auditory function with hearing tests, as well as otoacoustic emissions and stapedial reflexes, tympanometry, as well as a whole bunch of electrophysiology, understanding their auditory brainstem responses, their steady state responses, and their cortical electrophysiology. And so all of this very rich data is hopefully going to be able to tell us a lot about people's individual differences in sound sensitivity across all of these different dimensions, and how these categorical conditions are going to be associated with these underlying dimensions of neurophysiological changes as well as perceptual changes. I'd like to think that we're able to then get at mechanisms of these different conditions, and that can move us more toward targeted treatment and really getting at the heart of these conditions. Because really at the, right now, what we can say is, you're sensitive to sound, you might have this condition, and best of luck to you. But moving beyond that, it's going to very much matter whether or not we can say, what is the underlying mechanism, because that's going to move us toward what the treatment is. And so overall, the conclusion here is that decreased sound tolerance in autistic people is made up of three main conditions. And this is the thing that I really want people to take away. It's decreased sound tolerance, sound sensitivity, whatever you want to call it, is not a unitary construct. You have hyperacusis, you have misophonia, you have phonophobia, and there are other things that can make people, reduce their tolerance to sound as well. I mean, these aren't the only things. These are just the primary things. And all forms of sound tolerance are prevalent in autistic adults, with hyperacusis seemingly being the most common, at least in the sample that I found, and co-occurrence being the rule rather than the exception. Again, I mean, just because these things are separate conditions doesn't mean that they don't still co-occur quite a lot. And the other thing to note is that these conditions are phenotypically similar in autistic and non-autistic adults. We've studied a lot of these conditions, at least hyperacusis and misophonia, for a bit in non-autistic people. And for what it's worth, it does look like how they present in non-autistic people seems to be fairly similar to how they do in autistic people. Then we now have at least one measure, the MIST-A, that can assess all of them at the same time in both autistic and non-autistic people, and it functions the same in those two populations, meaning you can compare scores. And if I say, my score is higher than your score and I'm autistic and you're not, that means something, which is great. So group comparisons on the MIST-A are valid, and they confirm that autism is in fact associated with all of the decreased sound tolerance domains, and that's not an artifact. It also shows that we have stronger effects for hyperacusis related domains than misophonia, meaning that autism is more associated with hyperacusis than it is for misophonia. And that's the case for both comparing autism to the general population and clinical groups, another notable finding. And lastly, I think an important next step is to understand the perceptual and neural underpinnings of each of these decreased sound tolerance conditions, as I think this is going to pave the way for a deeper understanding of these conditions and the development of targeted mechanism-based treatments. And so with that, I will end and give the rest of my time up to questions. So yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you all listening. And yeah, thank you for coming to my talk.
Thank you so much, Zach, for presenting on your work in this area. It was really fascinating. We do have some time for questions and answers. We have about 6 minutes. I know someone had mentioned or wanted to throw a question in the chat, but she had to jump off. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand so we can allow you to talk, or type it in the chat so Zach has some time to address it. Great, thank you. We have one question. Results indicated that both hyperacusis and misophonia were associated with female sex assigned at birth in your Spark sample. Wondering if the same pattern in association with sex assigned at birth is seen in non-autistic adults as well.
Yeah, great question. So in the prolific sample that I used for the second study, I did look at misophonia and did find an association with misophonia status there. I haven't actually looked at associations with hyperacusis in that group, so I can't comment on that. But I would actually assume that it probably is, at least as far as we're defining it. That same case prevalence. And in fact, for what it's worth, in my independent or in the laboratory study that I have been running, participants coming in, just based on my recruitment flyers, are you sensitive to sound, blah, blah, blah. They've been about 80% female, which has been really interesting, actually. So, I mean, obviously, in psychology studies, you get a lot more females than males in general, but even, in the sound tolerance group, where I would, have expected a lot more autistic people, and things like the autistic group is even female skewed and things like that. So, yeah.
Also, Zach, if you don't mind going to the next slide, maybe I can give some time for some people to think of questions. I can go into detail or just mention our next webinar is going to be on Tuesday, June 20th. We would like you to invite you to register. I'll throw the link in the chat. And it will be with Haney M. Natry, PhD, excuse my pronunciation. So if you'd like to take some time to look into that, her talk will be on genomics for the well-being of autistic people, challenges and recommendations. And her description is on the slide there. So we still have a couple more minutes if anyone has any additional questions for Zach.
Yes. Sound evoked physical symptoms. I see that. Yeah, sorry. To repeat the question, how are sound evoked physical symptoms assessed? I was unsure if that was part of one of the measures or perhaps a separate measure or set of items. So in the previous study for that prevalence study, that was a separate set of items. Though now, actually, in the most recent version of the MIST-A, I have added some questions about sound evoked physical symptoms because of those findings. So there are now more standardized questions for that and on the measure if you're interested in those. But as far as those, I mean, the items there are we're actually just kind of if you have, if you've ever experienced, sound evoked symptoms, or if you, I forget exactly the wording, but it was a fairly inclusive definition of do you experience, these sorts of symptoms evoked by sound. So those numbers are probably a bit high, to be honest. But nevertheless, I think that the MIST-A currently has frequency items. So it's how often do you have, these sorts of symptoms evoked by sound in the past month, never, rarely, sometimes, often, blah, 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 with, actual frequency demarcations.
Hopefully the new link that we show, that shows today's webinar. Okay, we're trying to find an updated link for the next webinar. Otherwise, you can find it on our website. We'll throw it up on there before June for sure. There's another one. Thank you, Dana. Otherwise, if there aren't any other questions at this time, I'd like to thank all of you for attending the webinar. It is recorded, so we'll put it up on our ARP website and on our YouTube channel if you'd like to reference it or send it to others. And if you can, please take a few moments to complete our survey and provide feedback for future webinars. We'd really appreciate it. And I can throw that in here as well. So if there aren't any other questions, we can let you guys all go. Thank you so much. Thank you, Zach, as well.
All right, thanks so much, everyone.
Bye, Zach. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks.